Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Halifax Explosion, Nova Scotia, Canada, 1917. The harbour is still. The water, a pane of winter steel, lies cupped between two ridges of earth and timbered towns. Halifax, December 1917. A port city alive with the pulse of the First World War. Coal smoke drifts over rooftops. The shrill of a steam whistle echoes against wooden wharves. Sailors tramp up gangplanks with sacks of flour, crates of boots and sealed canisters of cordite. At night, the glow of lanterns flickers across black water, where destroyers and merchant steamers moor side by side, their hulls pressed against the heartbeat of an empire at war. This is not a quiet colonial outpost. Halifax, with its deep, ice-free harbour, is one of the Allies' most critical lifelines, a funnel for men, munitions, food and fuel bound across the Atlantic. Every morning, convoys assemble here, grey hulls stretched in lines like pews before a great cathedral of war. Every evening, the trains roll in, laden with goods pulled from the factories of Montreal, Toronto and New England. The city is bustling, and the people of Halifax are proud. They call it the Warden of the North. But they do not know, not yet, that within days their port will host the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen. A cataclysm so violent it will rip their lives apart, erase neighbourhoods, and leave scars visible more than a century later. To understand what is coming, picture Halifax in 1917 through the eyes of a wartime civilian. The city has grown restless under the constant reminder of war. Uniforms are everywhere. Blue wool of sailors, khaki of soldiers marching along Barrington Street. Families live with the constant unease that their sons may be swallowed by the Western Front. Telegrams arrive at doorsteps, carrying cold words of loss. Yet Halifax thrives economically. Shops sell luxuries shipped in from Europe. Taverns brim with laughter and ale. And the harbour, that immense natural amphitheatre of water, churns with life. Every vessel carries risk. There are hospital ships ferrying the wounded, colliers stacked with coal, freighters loaded with flour and timber. And then there are the floating powder kegs, ships stuffed to the gunwales with explosives, shells and fuel. They slip into Halifax like ghosts, hushed and watchful, awaiting their convoys to Europe. It is here, in these waters, that two fateful ships are about to meet. She is French, small and battered, a merchant steamer named Mont Blanc. At first glance she is unremarkable. 320 feet of steel hull, a single smokestack and a deck peppered with cargo hatches. Her crew are experienced men, hardened by years of wartime runs. But inside her holds lies doom. In December 1917, the Mont Blanc carries one of the deadliest cargoes ever assembled on a single ship. Nearly 3,000 tons of explosives, bound for France, 2,300 tons of picric acid, a volatile, yellow crystalline compound used in artillery shells, prone to detonation under heat or shock. 200 tons of TNT, packed in drums, 35 tons of highly flammable benzol, stored in barrels lashed on deck, and additional tons of gun cotton, another unstable explosive. No vessel entering Halifax that winter bore greater risk. The Mont Blanc's captain, Aimé Le Medec, knew it. His officers knew it. Every creak of timbers, every spark from a careless cigarette, every jolt against the dock threatened annihilation. And yet, this was war. Ships carried what the Allies needed, no matter the danger. At the same time, another vessel was stirring in Halifax Harbour, the Norwegian relief ship Imo. Unlike the Mont Blanc, The Immo was not a vessel of death, but of life. She had been chartered by the Belgian Relief Commission to carry supplies, food, clothing, medicine, to the war-ravaged people of Europe. The cause was noble, and her captain, Haakon From, was impatient to sail. But impatience in a narrow harbour crowded with ships could be deadly. The Immo had already been delayed for days, fuelling and awaiting her convoy orders. On the morning of the 6th of December, 1917, her crew prepared to steam down the Narrows, a slender channel connecting Bedford Basin with the outer harbour, but fate had already set her on a collision course. It began like any other morning. The sun climbed through a thin veil of winter haze. Frost crackled on window panes in Richmond, the working-class district that clung to the northern slopes of Halifax. Mothers lit coal stoves. Children tugged on woolen boots before rushing to school. Men with lunch tins trudged towards the rail yards. Over the city drifted the low thrum of engines, ships shifting in the harbour, gulls circling above the masts. From Citadel Hill, the great stone fortress that watched over Halifax since the 18th century, the view that morning was deceptively calm. A handful of ships manoeuvring in the channel, smoke coiling gently into the air. Few paused to notice a French freighter creeping in from the ocean and a Norwegian relief ship edging outward from Bedford Basin. Fewer still realised their paths were converging. The Narrows was a perilous stretch. Less than half a mile across, lined with docks, warehouses, and rickety piers, it was the maritime throat of Halifax. To pass safely, the vessels had to keep close to their own side of the channel, obeying rules that demanded caution and coordination. But that morning, confusion reigned. The Immo steamed down the wrong side of the channel, her captain insisting on speed. She sounded blasts of her whistle to assert her course. Ahead, smaller ships scurried to avoid her steel prow. Into this scene slid the Mont Blanc, inching cautiously towards Bedford Basin. Captain Lemedec, knowing the volatile cargo below his feet, ordered his men to steer with utmost care. He could not risk sudden movements. Every clang of machinery set nerves on edge. At 8:45 a.m, the two ships sighted one another across the narrowing water. The crews exchanged whistle signals. Confusing, contradictory, escalating. Neither would yield. Men leaned over rails, shouting across the water. Boilers thundered, chains rattled against decks. The gap between the two vessels shrank. And then steel met steel. The Immo's bow scraped across the starboard side of the Mont Blanc, splintering wood, tearing open drums of benzol lashed to the deck. The barrels burst. Liquid fire streamed across steel, spilling into the hold. The French crew froze, hearts pounding, as the air filled with the sickly sweet stench of gasoline. The first spark came from somewhere deep in the collision, metal against metal, a falling chain, a shattered lantern. The result was immediate. Flames leapt up the Mont Blanc's deck, racing across the spilled benzol. The ship became an inferno in seconds, orange tongues licking up her masts, black smoke boiling into the winter sky. Panic surged through the crew. They knew the truth. Their ship was a floating bomb, seconds away from annihilation. Captain Lemedec shouted for abandonment. Men scrambled for lifeboats, some leaping directly into the freezing harbour. Their faces were pale, eyes wild, as behind them the Mont Blanc burned brighter than any furnace. On shore, crowds gathered. Dock workers dropped tools and ran to the piers. Children, released early from school, pointed excitedly at the spectacle. Housewives leaned from windows, marvelling at the towering column of smoke. Few understood the danger. They thought it merely a ship fire. Some even hurried closer, eager for a better view. However, the clock was ticking. Picture it. The Mont Blanc, adrift in the Narrows, her decks consumed, her holds groaning under the heat. The crew, rowing frantically for shore, waving arms, screaming warnings in broken English and French. But their cries were lost in the chaos. The fire roared. Masts toppled. Smoke smeared across the sky like an oil painting gone black. And within the bowels of the ship, thousands of tons of explosives baked hotter with each passing second. Halifax, unaware, leaned closer to watch. The harbour clock struck 9, and time for the city was nearly over. For a few agonising moments the Mont Blanc burned like a torch, a drifting pyre in the heart of Halifax. Dock workers and school children stood transfixed. Housewives pressed hands to their mouths. Soldiers leaned on rifle butts, their eyes narrowing against the glare. All were silent, witnesses to the final terrible heartbeat before the city's undoing. And then the world ended. At 9:04 a.m, the Mont Blanc erupted. The detonation was beyond human comprehension. 2,900 tons of high explosive detonated simultaneously, a release of energy so vast it rivaled the force of a small nuclear bomb. In the instant of ignition, the ship vanished. Not shattered, not broken, but obliterated into incandescent fragments. A sphere of fire, white-hot at its core, rose like a second sun above the harbour. A shockwave of searing air raced outward faster than thought. In Richmond, every window burst inward. Glass turned to shrapnel, walls buckled, entire houses lifted from their foundations, crumpling like toys. Streets vanished in clouds of dust and flame. A column of smoke and fire towered 2 kilometres into the winter sky. Witnesses later swore it was like a volcano had erupted in the harbour. For miles around, the morning dimmed, as if the heavens themselves recoiled. The pressure wave ripped through the city in concentric rings. On the waterfront, piers splintered. Horses collapsed in tangled harnesses. Railway wagons toppled like dominoes. In the naval dockyards, men were hurled against steel walls, their bodies broken before they could even cry out. Blocks inland, houses folded in upon themselves, roofs sheared away, bricks spun like hailstones. Families were buried alive in collapsing kitchens and bedrooms. And at the very epicentre, Richmond ceased to exist. Entire streets, Kay, Campbell, Albert, Richmond Road itself, simply vanished beneath a rolling surge of debris and flame. More than 1,600 people died in that moment, their lives extinguished in the blink of an eye. The blast was heard over 250 kilometres away. In Prince Edward Island, telegraph operators noted their wires quiver. In Cape Breton, miners ran from the earthworks, believing an underground disaster had struck. Even in Boston, far to the south, faint tremors registered, though none could have guessed their origin. In Halifax itself, horror reigned. Thousands lay injured, many torn by glass, wood, or jagged brick. Men staggered through the ruins, eyes streaming blood, bodies shredded by flying debris. Mothers screamed for missing children, clawing at rubble with bare hands. The human eye was particularly vulnerable. Nearly every household kept windows open that morning to let in the weak winter light. When the blast came, the glass shattered inward with lethal speed. It is said that 9 out of 10 of Halifax's eye injuries that day were caused in that single instant. Dozens were blinded for life. And then came the fire. Flames erupted across Richmond, fueled by shattered oil tanks, overturned stoves and splintered timber. Entire blocks were engulfed. Those who survived the blast found themselves trapped in a furnace, smoke choking their lungs, flames closing in on all sides. But nature was not finished, and the explosion did not end with fire and shock. The harbour itself, that ancient glacial basin, convulsed in response. In the instant of detonation, thousands of tons of water were displaced. The sea, struck by a force equal to an earthquake, heaved upward in a vast dome of spray and shattered ice. Witnesses later said it was as though the ocean tried to leap into the sky. Then the water collapsed back, a thunderous roar, louder than cannon fire. Waves surged outward from the epicentre, walls of water that curled and broke against the harbour walls. Barges were tossed like kindling. Dories splintered. A schooner, weighing hundreds of tons, was lifted clean out of the water and thrown bodily onto the Dartmouth shore, where it lay like a wrecked toy. The tsunami raced into the Narrows, the channel funneling the surge with terrifying speed. On the Dartmouth side, rail cars loaded with coal were swept from the tracks and plunged into the sea, their iron wheels shrieking as they disappeared beneath the froth. Warehouses crumpled. Men working the yards were hurled into the freezing harbour, some never to resurface. On the Halifax side, the wave struck the devastated shoreline where Richmond had once stood. Piers shattered, timbers snapping like matchsticks. The water clawed inland, rushing into streets already buried in rubble. Survivors pinned beneath beams and walls were suddenly engulfed, their cries silenced in an instant beneath the dark surge. And then, almost as quickly, the sea retreated. It dragged with it wreckage and the broken dead, sucking them back into the harbour's depths. The water fell away so dramatically that parts of the seabed lay exposed, mud glistening under the choking smoke. Fish flapped helplessly on the sand. Stunned sailors stared as anchors and cables lay revealed on ground that had not seen the sky for centuries. One of the Mont Blanc's colossal anchors, a half-ton of iron, was hurled nearly 3 kilometres inland, crashing into a quiet grove of trees. Its resting place became a monument in itself, a reminder of how far the force of the blast and the fury of the sea had reached. The tsunami was not the largest wave Halifax would ever know, but in that moment, amid fire and smoke and ruin, it felt biblical. To survivors stumbling through the wreckage, the water's assault was not simply another tragedy. It was a message, a reminder that nature, once disturbed, would punish without mercy. The Mont Blanc itself had ceased to exist, save for fragments hurled incredible distances. Her anchor shaft, weighing half a ton, was flung more than 3 kilometres inland, where it gouged into the earth and remained embedded for decades. Pieces of her hull rained across the city, landing on rooftops, fields, and distant woods. What was it like in those first moments? Imagine the sound. A man named Vince Coleman, a railway dispatcher, had been working at the Richmond rail station. He saw the Mont Blanc aflame, realised the danger, and sent a desperate telegraph message to halt an incoming passenger train. "Hold up the train. Munitions ship on fire. Approaching Pier 6. Goodbye." Coleman's message saved hundreds of lives, and the train halted miles away. But he himself was killed instantly when the station disintegrated in the blast. Nearby, a young woman named Barbara Orr remembered the moment with chilling clarity. "There was a blinding sheet of light, and I felt myself flying through the air. When I came to, I was pinned beneath beams. All was dark. Then I heard voices, crying, praying, and the crackle of fire." Another survivor, a boy named James, recalled staggering into the street, only to find his mother gone, their home reduced to splinters. He walked barefoot for hours through glass and snow, clutching a shard of wood as though it were a talisman against the horror. Halifax had been transformed in less than 2 minutes. Richmond was gone, a wasteland of smouldering ruins, blackened chimneys jutting like tombstones from the earth. Entire families were erased, their names never again to be called in the streets or schools of the city. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors, themselves injured, worked by lantern light amid broken walls. Nurses tore their own clothing into bandages. Churches became makeshift morgues. For hours, survivors wandered aimlessly through the smoke, The air was filled with the cries of the injured, the shouts of rescuers, and the eerie silence of those too stunned to speak. Snow began to fall, blanketing the ruins in white, a cruel cold shroud over the carnage. By midday, Richmond was still burning. The fire engines that might have helped were smashed or overturned. Water mains lay fractured. Firefighters, many dead or wounded, could do little. Those trapped beneath rubble faced a terrible choice: remain and suffocate, or scream for help that might never come. Witnesses later recalled the sound of faint voices drifting from collapsed houses, fading as the hours passed. The smell of burning flesh and timber rolled across Halifax. Men with shovels clawed through wreckage to pull out survivors. Others found only charred remains. The scale of death was too vast to reckon with in those first hours. It would take days before the enormity of loss was understood. In Dartmouth, the devastation was also immense. On the Dartmouth shore, just across from Halifax, had stood a small Mi'kmaq settlement known as Turtle Grove. The Mi'kmaq are the indigenous people of this region, their ancestors living along these coasts for thousands of years, fishing the waters and trading with early Europeans long before Halifax was founded. By 1917, Turtle Grove was a modest community of families who still carried their traditions and language, even as colonial expansion pressed in around them. When the explosion struck, Turtle Grove was obliterated, its people killed, its homes erased, and its presence on the harbour's edge lost to history almost overnight. In the naval yards, ships lay torn and twisted. A schooner was lifted clear out of the water and dumped onto the shore like a child's toy. The blast had no respect for rank or station. Admirals and dock workers alike were struck down in its fury. In those first hours, survivors struggled to make sense of what had happened. Some thought it was a German attack, a U-boat shelling the harbour, or even a Zeppelin raid. The war had conditioned minds to expect enemy sabotage. Others, religious by nature, believed Judgment Day had arrived. A priest at St. Joseph's Church knelt amid shattered pews, reciting prayers for the dying. Children wept for parents who would never answer. And through it all, the snow thickened, settling quietly over the ruins, muffling the cries, turning blood-darkened streets into surreal landscapes of red and white. By nightfall, Halifax was a city of ghosts. Lanterns bobbed among the ruins as rescuers searched desperately. Families huddled in churches, schools, even railway cars, wherever there was shelter from the biting cold. The homeless numbered in the thousands. The injured cried out, many untreated, lying on floors or bare ground. And still the fires glowed, sullen and relentless, painting the winter sky with a dull orange haze. In those hours, Halifax was no longer a city of war effort and bustling commerce. It was a place broken, stunned, and utterly vulnerable. Yet help was coming. Across the sea, in Boston, news had already reached railway stations and telegraph offices. Halifax had suffered a catastrophe. Doctors, nurses, and supplies were being readied, trains loaded, engines stoked. But for Halifax, the long cold night of 6th December was only the beginning of its agony. Fires still burned across Richmond, smouldering heaps casting orange light against the snow. Families huddled in shattered churches, railway sheds, and the basements of half-collapsed homes. The wounded moaned in overcrowded hospitals, where exhausted nurses bent over them by lantern light, their hands sticky with blood. Halifax was broken, but it was not alone. Dawn revealed the full scale of destruction. The northern half of Halifax lay flattened, 325 acres reduced to rubble and ash. Entire districts were erased, the familiar map of streets replaced by a wasteland of broken timber, crushed brick, and twisted iron. Where once houses had stood shoulder to shoulder, there now gaped only raw earth and smoking craters. Bodies lay beneath snowdrifts, some untouched since the blast. Others were horribly maimed, frozen in the positions in which death had found them. Survivors moved silently among them, numb, too shocked for tears. Doctors spoke later of the eerie quiet. Thousands of injured, yet so few cries, because voices were lost to shock, to broken jaws, to lungs scoured by dust and flame. It was not simply a city in ruins, it was a community hollowed. As if fate had not yet finished with Halifax, a snowstorm arrived the very next day. Heavy flakes fell relentlessly, coating ruins in white. Rescue work slowed as men with bare hands tried to dig through snow-covered rubble, praying to hear the faint knock of survivors. Fires still smouldered beneath the drifts, sending up strange plumes of steam. The storm brought bitter cold. Families who had escaped the blast now froze in roofless houses or open fields. The injured, lying on stretchers or wagon beds, shivered uncontrollably, their wounds crusting with ice. And yet, in some strange way, the snow also preserved the dead, holding their remains until they could be claimed, delaying decay, giving families a chance for recognition in the grim days that followed. The toll was staggering. Nearly 2,000 people were killed outright. Thousands more were wounded, many grievously. Over 25,000 were left homeless in the middle of a Canadian winter. The morgues filled quickly, forcing churches and schools into grim service, as places where families might walk among rows of bodies, searching desperately for loved ones. The sight of those halls haunted survivors for decades. The smell of lime, the silence broken only by the sobs of recognition. Yet amid this sea of loss there were extraordinary stories of survival. A sailor blown into the harbour clung to wreckage and crawled ashore hours later, frostbitten but alive. A child thrown through a window by the blast was found, dazed but unhurt, miles away. One infant was lifted from the rubble, still clutching a doll, the only possession to survive from her family's home. Word of the disaster spread quickly. By the evening of the 6th, telegraphs were crackling across the continent. In Boston, the news struck like a hammer. Halifax was a familiar ally. Convoys bound for Europe had long gathered there under American naval escort. The people of Massachusetts felt a deep kinship. By nightfall, trains were being loaded. Doctors, nurses, and supplies surged into rail yards. The Boston Red Cross mobilized. City officials and clergy joined the effort. One train left that very night, its wheels biting through snow, plunging northward towards a ruined city it had not yet seen. In Canada, too, neighbouring provinces rallied. From New Brunswick, from Quebec, even from Ontario, doctors and volunteers poured east. Halifax had been shattered in a moment, but the bonds of a continent were being summoned to piece it back together. In the days that followed, Halifax became a place of desperate heroism. Firefighters, many wounded themselves, fought flames with little more than buckets and melted snow. Priests and ministers walked among the ruins, offering last rites to the dying and comfort to the living. Ordinary citizens dug with bare hands, hauling beams and bricks from collapsed homes to pull strangers free. Women tore up their curtains to bind wounds. Children ferried water and food to the exhausted searchers. And there was the story of Dr. George Cox, an eye specialist who treated hundreds of blast victims suffering from glass injuries. He operated for hours on end, performing eye removals with swift precision, sometimes without anaesthetic. Thanks to him, many were saved from infection, though sight, tragically, could not be restored. These stories of sacrifice softened slightly the jagged horror of those days. The aid train from Boston arrived on 8th December. It carried doctors, nurses, food, blankets, and medical supplies, everything a shattered city required. The people of Halifax wept when they saw the Americans. For days, Boston's team worked without pause. Hospitals were set up in schools and churches. Soup kitchens sprang to life. Frozen survivors were clothed and fed. The gratitude ran deep, so deep, in fact, that Halifax made a promise. Each year it would send to Boston the city's official Christmas tree as a token of thanks. That tradition continues to this day. A towering evergreen raised in Boston Common, a living symbol of friendship born out of tragedy. Reconstruction began almost immediately. Architects and planners descended upon Halifax, envisioning not merely a rebuilt city but a modern one. Streets were widened, houses redesigned, new neighbourhoods planned. Out of the ashes of Richmond arose the Hydrostone district, rows of sturdy stone houses built to resist fire, today one of Halifax's most distinctive quarters. But rebuilding the city was not the same as healing its people. Families had been broken. Survivors carried lifelong injuries. Many children became orphans overnight. Veterans returning from Europe later found their home city unrecognisable, scarred in ways even the trenches could not prepare them for. The scars were emotional as well as physical. For decades, survivors spoke of recurring nightmares. The sound of shattering glass, the sudden silence before the blast, the blinding sheet of light. The Halifax explosion became not just an event, but a wound carved into memory. The Halifax explosion stood as the largest human-made blast prior to the atomic age. The sheer scale of destruction stunned the world. Engineers studied it to better understand the mechanics of blast waves. Military planners noted how fragile cities could be, and survivors, in their grief, taught future generations about resilience in the face of devastation. The Mi'kmaq people of Turtle Grove never truly recovered, their settlement erased, their presence in Halifax diminished by the tragedy. Their loss is one of the quieter but enduring legacies of the explosion, and yet from the ruins rose solidarity. Halifax became a symbol of international compassion. The bond with Boston remains unbroken. Each December, when the great Christmas tree is lit in Boston, Haligonians remember not only the destruction but the hands that reached out to lift them from it. Stand now at the harbour's edge in Halifax, more than a century later. The waters are calm again, blue under the Atlantic sky. Tankers and ferries pass through the Narrows as though nothing ever happened. The city hums with modern life, universities, markets, music drifting from waterfront cafes. But history lingers. Plaques and monuments mark the ground where Richmond once stood. Museums preserve fragments of the Mont Blanc. And in the Hydrostone district, children play in streets built on the ashes of that terrible morning. It is difficult even today to comprehend the force that levelled a city in less than 2 minutes. But history is not only about destruction. It is about what rises after, the courage of survivors, the compassion of neighbours, the endurance of memory. Halifax, December 1917. A story carved into the soul of Canada. A warning about the cost of war, the fragility of peace, and the strength of human spirit. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.